Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this final panel of the day for the Global World Beyond War Conference. We're going to be speaking to this evening about abolition. My name is Desmond Cole. I am a journalist, activist, and author here in Toronto. And I'd like to welcome all of you. Maybe some of you have been partaking in some of the other things that have been going on today. We're very excited to see such a wonderful crowd of people and to share this conversation with you this evening. Also like to say hello to everybody who's on the live stream. For those of you in the room who don't know, there are people from all over the place, literally around the globe, who've been taking part in the conference this weekend and who are watching us and listening to us right now. So we're going to try also to include them in the conversation this evening. I would like to remind everybody, you probably saw on the way in that there's a whole bunch of great tabling going on outside. We've got groups like Panay Collection, Standing Up for Racial Justice, or SURGE, Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction. And there's going to be an opportunity for you to check more of that out and to get some more food once we're finished here. Also, I'm saying this to remind myself that we're going to be asking you to, if you can, support one really important initiative that's going on right now to support people who are putting their bodies on the line. You know, I see a lot of Kafias in the room, and there's a lot of us who I see and I recognize in this room who've been in the streets raising our voices for Palestine and solidarity with Palestinians. And the Toronto Community Justice Fund is an organization that has been fundraising to make sure that when people are criminalized for doing that work, that they have support to get like aftercare, legal supports, and to be in community with each other. I know this because I'm one of the many over 100 and whatever it is now people who have been arrested for, you know, being in the streets. And the community that's being created through a number of groups, including the Toronto Community Justice Fund, is like really, really important. So we're asking if you have a few bucks to support them this evening, that you do that. It is my honor now to introduce our panel for this evening's discussion on abolition. All three of the people who are seated at this table with me are friends, comrades, or people who I have come into encounters with because of our collective work in this city and beyond. People that I'm grateful for and who I'm honored to share this stage with this evening. So let me start just to my right with Bree Olson-Pitawanakwat, who is an Anishinaabe Indigiqueer, a member of the Wigwamkwang Nation, the unceded Wigwamkwang First Nation. I know Bree mainly for your incredible work with Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction in the city of Toronto, a life-saving initiative that is necessary because of the abandonment by our governments of people who are living on our streets, particularly Indigenous people who have no place to stay, who may be using drugs, who may be involved in the life of the streets in one way or another and need supports that they're not getting from the people who should be providing it. And you have written extensively on the work that you've been doing for places like Yellowhead Institute, and you have taught me a lot about harm reduction and about the particular context of Indigenous peoples in the city. I was just reading a lot about your work relating to different government bills in Ontario that have been brought down against homeless people, against people who use drugs, and it's a real honor to be able to be here with you this evening. Thank you so much. Welcome, Bree. Next to Bree is Syed Hussan, who is Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, somebody who I've been encountering over more than 15 years, I think, doing work in this city, doing work on things like the sanctuary city, policies in the city, I will never forget the time that I accompanied you and many other people on a trip to Canada Border Services Agency in Mississauga, and we ran through the halls. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. We ran through the halls where they do interviews of people who are set to be deported, and the hall is this narrow, terrible place out in Mississauga, and people ran through, banging on the walls, postering the entire space so that people could hear us. And then we went in and took over the intake center. Yeah, it was pretty amazing. And Hussan has just done a lot of work and a lot of writing over the years that has helped me understand migrant justice issues in this country. I always am able to call on you when I have a question about something that I'm working on journalistically. And it's also a wonderful pleasure to have you here. Welcome, Hussan. And next to Hussan is, of course, Rachel Small, who is the Canada organizer for World Beyond War Canada, and one of the people responsible for all the incredible programming that has been going on this weekend. And Rachel is everywhere, organizing people who are doing some of the most, I think, important direct actions when it comes to exposing Canadian government and company industry like complicity in the ongoing genocide by Israel of Palestinians, doing direct actions at places that are kind of at the heart of Canada's involvement, that being weapons manufacturers in particular. And you teach us, Rachel, because I think without this work, a lot of us don't even know that these places exist. We don't know that they're in our neighborhoods. We don't know who's behind them. The excellent work that you folks have done to demonstrate, for example, how the embargo that Canada said it was going to engage in, that we were going to stop new weapons shipments to Israel, and then it was your work and other people's that demonstrated that that actually wasn't happening, and that you were able to track weapons that are continuing to be shipped to Israel despite the promises of the government, and opening our eyes and holding governments accountable in such a very difficult and I think often hidden climate. So on top of that, being able to organize all of this and bring people together, we're extremely, extremely grateful for all the work that you do. Welcome to this panel. We're here to have a conversation this evening about abolition, and I'm going to try and be as humble as possible because I'm no expert in this subject. I am learning, and maybe some of you feel like that this evening as well, and that's great. Some of you watching online, same thing. But we think that it is important to have a conversation where we go beyond what I've been talking about, which is the day-to-day grind that all of us are in together, and talk more about why we're doing this and what kind of world we envision that is driving us to do the work that we're doing, how we have, I guess you could say, like a better horizon of imagination for what the world could be if it wasn't as it is today, a world without systems of criminalization and punishment, a world where all of people's basic needs are being met, a world where we don't have to struggle because of our identities or our migration status or our ability or disability, a world where we can conceive of liberation, I guess, in a way that is not like the absence of something. This is a hard conversation and a hard question, though, and it's not one that we get a lot of time to engage in. So I want to start by asking each of you, and I'll start on this end, Rachel, with you, and come back, and just ask each of you to tell me and tell us how you think about the idea of abolition and how it relates to the work that you do every day.
Thanks, Desmond. And thanks to everyone for being here tonight. For those like online or in the room who've also been joining the conference all weekend. Like it's felt like such a luxury to actually be able to sit with this question and like to sit with abolition and to um like create space for vision and for visionary thinking. So yeah, I've noted some notes on also some of the things that have come up over the weekend and that really stood out for me. So I'll refer to some of those. But yeah, I mean, for me, abolition is definitely both that vision, but also like a political strategy. Like it's a project of liberation, but when I thought about it, for me, like it's really also a very specific collection of goals, of practices, of strategies, of campaigns, of movements that, yes, are all aimed at abolishing these institutions, these forces of violence, from prison to police to borders to war to colonization. Um, and we've been holding this conference as World Beyond War this weekend, like, of course, because we believe in intersectionality, in standing together across struggles, in supporting each other's movements, but also because we know all these things are connected. And we can't do anti-war work. We can't fight for the abolition of the war machine without also being in struggle against all these other institutions of state violence, which are how the people in power keep things the way they are, right? Like this violence is required for them to maintain economic and political power for those who have it. So for me, when we act through abolition, it's an act of refusal, of rejecting that violent status quo, and of course committing to build something better together. So I think it's about throwing out the assumptions that the way things are is the way things have to be and imagining all other kind of ways to relate to each other from the community, neighborhood, like interpersonal relationship level, all the way up to the state level to internationally. An invitation to reimagine safety and security, like beyond punishment, beyond control, beyond state violence. And like Desmond said, it actually can be hard to imagine because we're so steeped in it. Um, but yeah, for me, ultimately, like I think abolition is a verb, it's a practice. And when I talk about war abolition, it's that like vision, strategy, but also that day by day work to abolish all militarism. So, I mean, what does that even include, right? I obviously includes what the Canadian military is concretely doing, like what the Canadian armed forces is, be that the actions of soldiers domestically or abroad, the secret foreign bases Canada is building all over the world. Does anyone here in the room even heard anything about the fact that there's secret Canadian bases in Kuwait and Senegal and Jamaica? It's about the like weapons purchases that the Canadian military is making. They're trying to buy billions of dollars worth of F-35s right now, the exact fighter jet that Israel's been using to drop 2,000-pound bombs on Gazans in their tents, but also the broader war machine, right? So there's like what the literal Canadian military is doing, if we're talking in a Canadian context, but there's also the entire, if we're talking weapons industry that sure sells weapons, but also has hundreds of lobbyists on Parliament Hill wandering around every day, not just trying to sell their weapons to support what the Canadian military is doing, but like literally, and the Breach actually did incredible journalism finding those lobbyists and noting that they are in fact helping to set Canadian foreign policy to meet the needs of what the weapons dealers are trying to peddle. So I mean, we should also maybe just, I'll only take one more minute, like expand that circle even one step further, because Canadian militarism is also just our militarized foreign policy. Like if we look at Canadian mining, right? These Canadian mining companies around the world with full unconditional support of the Canadian government, they're not only wreaking havoc on communities around the world, stealing Indigenous land, inflicting severe environmental destruction, etc. A big part of how Canadian militarism plays out is actually in order to secure those mines. Because the Canadian mining industry, it's not only the global leader in mining, but specifically in the extraction of these materials to create war machine. So Canadian military might is being used around the world to make sure those Canadian mines are safe, to steal land from Indigenous people and contaminate it. But then literally the materials they're extracting, from uranium to rare earth elements, are being turned around and are going back into those same war machines around the world. So to name the F-35, every single one of those F-35s bombing Gaza has over 900 pounds of rare earth elements, one of the rarest things to mine on the planet. Not to mention domestic military ops, which ties in so closely with ongoing militarized colonization. I mean, the first and primary form of warfare for Canada is colonization. And when it became harder for the Canadian state to pursue that through militarized means, like directly attacking and killing Indigenous people in their communities, they've continued that through police violence, right? We know Indigenous people are surveilled, over-policed, and that, of course, are targeted the most for military recruitment. I think in the past few years, it's never been more clear the way that militarized police forces are enacting this terrible violence from coast to coast, especially against racialized communities, while building military bases in ways that also continue to steal and contaminate Indigenous land. I looked it up yesterday, and bases around Canada already cover over 2 million hectares. That's half the size of Switzerland across so-called Canada. Canada, meanwhile, of course, is spending upwards of 20 times more to militarize its borders than on any kind of climate financing. So basically, Canada, one of the countries most responsible for the climate crisis, is spending vastly more arming its borders to keep climate refugees out than on actually doing anything to prevent this harm. I could kind of go on and on, but basically, if we're talking about war abolition, for me, we're talking about all of that. We're talking about abolishing all of the militarism, and that was kind of just in a Canadian context. Yeah, I'll stop her there now.
Thank you. You mentioned the breach. I should have said at the top that I work there. I'm the senior journalist at the breach. So when you mentioned the work that we are doing, that's what you're referring to. Hussan, when we were talking about this conversation, you said something I thought was really interesting, which was that the thinking about abolition when it comes to migration is not just at the border. It's an extremely expansive definition in your mind. So tell us about that. Maybe start there.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I think when we think about the border, right? When you all think about the border, you probably think about the border as something that exists at sort of the periphery of a country. Is that true? Right? You think that it's something at the edges and that it's kind of a gate. You're either let in or let out, right? That's the kind of definition or understanding of the border. But if you think about it a bit more, you know that the border simply doesn't keep people in or out. It lets in people like migrant workers, refugees, undocumented people who are let in, but not as whole beings. You are allowed in, but without your family. You're allowed in, but you no longer have rights. You are allowed in, but you can't get health care. You're allowed in, but you don't have dignity. So the border is not simply a thing that lets people in and out. It's a thing that transforms. Okay, I want you to hold that thought for a moment. The second thing is the border is not simply at the periphery. When a migrant or you go to open up a bank account, the border reemerges. Your identification determines whether you have access. Whether you go to get healthcare, whether you try to get a driver's license, whether you apply for employment insurance, whether you try to speak up against a bad boss. At every site, the border reemerges, often invisible, but always present. Okay? So it's at the periphery, it's at the edges, and it's letting people in and out, but it's transforming them in the process. And then it is everywhere. And then who is it that says you can't get healthcare? Who is it that says you can't get education? Who is it that says you can't get a driver's license? Border guards are all of us, right? We are activating ourselves into this thing. So, and this is global. Now, the third thing is the border does exist at the periphery. It exists at all of these sites in the internal, but the border also transforms all of us. What do I mean by that? right now, whether you look at the US Trump doctrine, whether you see what's happening in India, whether you see Pakistan deporting Afghanis, the migrant is the thing through which everything else, all other forms of exploitation are made possible. So right now, Canada and the US are in a tariff war. What's Trump's reason for the tariffs? Because Canada is letting in migrants, letting in fentanyl through the border. The US government, anytime it has a problem, Trump can distract the whole of people against who? The migrants. Around the world, in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand, here in Canada, what do we hear? Our price of housing is too high because there are too many outsiders, right? This form is very, very deep, right? When I think about the question of even, right now, Canada's team is playing in the Blue Jays. Thank you for all being here. Right? The Blue Jays is not playing it's playing in the World Series, the Blue Jays. Sorry. I know a lot about baseball. Not at all. So the point is, we are constantly reimagining a world that's boundaried, in which we, as the self, if you must, are made only because we are in opposition to something else. What makes you Canadian? Well, most Canadians would say we're not Americans, right? But more importantly, so when you've heard about this question, migrants are coming here, and sometimes people say, is it good for the Canadian economy? What is the Canadian economy? Does the Canadian economy include all workers here, but then it would include migrants too? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the border is at the periphery, it's everywhere, and it's producing each and every one of us. So when we talk about the question of border abolition, not open borders, not migrant rights, not immigration justice, all of which I also do, mostly that's what I do, but when we talk about the abolition of the border, you're talking about a different world altogether. One in which there is no displacement, there is no war, there are no citizens. I want you to imagine a world, if right now there were no borders outside Canada, what would happen? The displaced, the dispossessed, we, the wretched, will come here. We should still come here, and we will. But in the meantime, right, you cannot just talk about one country, one form of policy, one system. Abolition is our North Star, right? Just like socialism is our North Star. It is what guides our work. It is the question. Abolition is the question we use to determine every step, because it is so difficult, right? To then apply every question when you fight for wages, when you speak up against the exploitation of migrant workers on tight permits, when people are, defending their communities against deportations. Those can, but aren't necessarily abolition. Abolition is producing a whole new world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bree, you have, I'll let you do that. You have talked a lot to me when we were preparing for this about the idea of sovereignty and how it relates to abolition, and about how we cannot ask for permission for this new world that we're trying to build and to imagine together. So I would invite you to start there with the same question.
Absolutely. All right. Honey, minigishgad nimigwachundam kinwia. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. I came to abolition by necessity. I think that many Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, Inuit in this country have a similar experience. You come to a perspective around abolition because of a lived experience of not being protected by law enforcement, borders, whatever systems that exist in this country, child welfare, but rather being a what they would consider a perpetrator or criminalized or policed by those systems. That experience for me began very young. It was at 11 years old. I had my first negative interaction with police where I was a victim and was turned away. And throughout my entire young life, that was a reality. I think of people like Tina Fontaine, and if you have a chance and you haven't read her story, that is my story. And that is the story of so many children in this country who may have survived and many didn't, where police had a opportunity to take perpetrators to task and did not, because they are complicit and I would say participating in these systems of violence against Indigenous people. And when I say, I mean, for me, it was, targeting as a youth, but that is the story of Canada, isn't it? That is the story of colonization here. It is impossible to look at the roots of policing, the carceral system, the jail system, without seeing how those are rooted in the displacement of Indigenous peoples from our land and from our cultural practices. And I often think about how we think this is so far away. There's a really wonderful book by Doug Williams. It's called This Is Our Land, Mississauga Nishnawbek. So it's actually rooted right here. Most of it is rooted right here in so-called Toronto. And he talks about how we think of Toronto as like this ancient entity that was like here since the 1900s. That is actually not the case. The settlement of what we now know as Toronto today actually happened really aggressively in like the 1950s and the 1960s. And it was when Indigenous people had signed on to treaty, were promised all of the things that we are promised on our traditional territories. So Indigenous people were doing things that actually we see every day here. Trying to post up next to a body of water to sleep, trying to access the land so that they can pray, so that they can literally just live and survive, trying to fish. And what existed at that time was not the modern police forces that you see today. They were actually militias that were homeowners that would come out with their guns and they would shoot at the Native people. And that mentality and that partnership, I would say, with homeowners and with modern day policing is as strong as ever. And that is like very much the root of what we see here today in Toronto. We talk about child welfare, another piece that is absolutely has its roots within the displacement of Indigenous peoples on their land. And what we often think of police as like I hear people say it all the time. Oh, we pay your bills. We're the taxpayers. I pay your wages. We might pay their wages, but we're definitely not informing anything that they're doing. We are not making any decisions. We have zero input. Because police, in my mind, we think of police as an extension of the government. For Indigenous people, police are its own mechanism of colonization onto its own. And when we look at places like Edmonton, which is where I started my Amiskochi Waskahegan, which is like where I started my harm reduction practice, we see police begin to take on a mafia kind of feel. They are in direct opposition to the city government. They do whatever they want, and then they begin brazenly doing very, very, very brutal things to people in the community that they've done forever, but just behind closed doors. And this is a dynamic that you see in cities with a lot of Indigenous people, and a dynamic that you see here in Toronto. And when you see people like Ford having, conversations, closed door conversations with people like in the Toronto police, and then you see things like, brutal encampment evictions, or you see people, for marching down a certain street getting, all beat up. There's no legislation behind it, but it's happening. You start to realize how much more it's like, it's completely lawless. And that we really have no control over what that mechanism does. Indigenous people have been sounding the alarm on this for like a really long time. I think that it is absolutely the root of everything that we do within our communities. And I just want to say one last thing, and it's about borders. I carry something called a status card. My life is governed by the Indian Act. And there are borders within borders here. We have a crisis of monumental proportions that every single day, so Alex Wilson, who's one of the founders of Idle No More, they called colonization the wicked problem because it only worsens. It doesn't get better. No matter what you do, no matter how many, thoughtful, heartfelt, actions are done by everyday Canadians, it doesn't get better. And that wicked problem is the Indian Act. It is this fourth world conditions and these places that our communities have been relegated to. And it does transform you. It transforms the lives of every single person in this country, whether you are Indigenous or not. And it really is the big dirty secret that nobody can even really get a grasp on, I think. So for us in our communities, we were born resisting. We were born to do this, whether or not we have woken up to that. Some of us have, some of us haven't. That's totally fine. But that is our fight as Indigenous people, because we are under attack and we're in a war every single day that we wake up in this country. So yeah, again, like I had no choice. I don't know. It's who you are. You are politicized the moment you are born as an Indigenous person in this country. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. You can keep that. Yeah. Thank you. I want to pick up on something that you just said, Bree, and go back this way, because you talked about an expansive idea of colonialism, or and this idea that things are not remaining static; they're getting worse. I think about my own work around policing, and I think about things like the state trying to make normal putting police officers in our schools, the state trying to make normal the idea of like neighborhood or so-called community policing, so that a police officer has a normal role in literally any space that they want to in everyday life in this country. And I think my very little reading and thinking about this subject tells me that part of the inspiration for abolitionist thinking is not just the state of things as they are today. It's that they continue to encroach upon and swallow every aspect of our lives and take away more and more livability. So I'm wondering from each of you, and I'll start with you, Bree, this time, maybe you can even just name one area in your own work where you see or are experiencing this state expansion into maybe even new territories, or deeper into territories than it's been in the past.
Yeah. So I think, the assault now on things like harm reduction are profound. there was just an announcement that Parkdale Queen West safe consumption site, which is one of the last ones in the city after Bill 223 went through, is going to be slated for closure. And I mean, that is at the behest of the Ford government in collaboration with the police, who are taking, notes from the community, the homeowners in the community. And I think that is like one facet of this expansion and what it does. And when we look at, and it seeps into everything. And I think that this is just the importance of people really grasping the history that Indigenous people have on your territory. It's really easy to like think broadly about Canada, but like, what about Toronto? Right? And like, who here has actually done reading about the history of Indigenous people in this territory? There's a lot out there. So I think that you have to ground yourself in that and how the mechanisms of displacement of Indigenous people from their lands, from their governance systems, is very much alive here. And when we look at things like drug laws, and this is something that we said when we did the intervener status on the Bill 223 case, is that we're always like consent, free prior informed consent around like land use and resource extraction, and that Indigenous peoples have to have this, but like, what about our healthcare? And healthcare 100% is a mechanism of the state. It is as imperative to address the inequalities in those systems for Indigenous people as it is to address policing, because our people are being shut out of these systems, right? There's a two-tier system in this country. So we're seeing that. And there is just a complete focus on drug use and the toxic drug supply from a policing standpoint. And this is the moral panic. This is the rhetoric from Trump and the US. But this is like decades long drug war on drugs that has existed for so long. But I think now they have seen the advancements that have been made within the harm reduction field. I mean, we have people like Zoe here who have to shut out because they're just incredible, but like, people have been advocating for this for decades. And all of these advancements we've made to actually literally save lives, which is what harm reduction is about. Indigenous people are vastly overrepresented as people who die from the toxic drug supply, that they see the efficiency and they want to tear that down. So that's what's happening now, is a tear down and a repealing of all of the advancements that have been made to literally save lives. And we're just moving this regressive direction, and it's terrifying. But I think on the other side of that, what we're seeing is that there is being more done to stop us from talking about it. It's not just the fact that they're doing this, it's the fact that they're creating laws so that you can't even go out to protest these things, that you can't even show up at your MLA or your MPP's office or your MP, you literally can't, because it is now, we have things like Bill C9 that is coming out that are making intimidation a criminal offense. And I remember when I was a drug user myself in Edmonton, it was in the middle of like a crystal meth crisis. And I showed up and we would storm like the politicians, like big meetings, because, this is how it goes, is like, you're infantilized and you're dangerous. So you can't make any of your own decisions and you're totally dehumanized. And we would storm those meetings and they would say, oh, sorry, we can't have you here because you're unsafe. But I'm literally a human being who's like at risk of like traumatic death, and I need to talk about my healthcare. And so those kind of things, that's what they're cracking down on, is that people can't even speak up anymore. So I think that that's the other terrifying part of this all, is that it really is going in that direction. So
It's really wild. I actually started my working life in Toronto as a harm reduction worker too, and to see that one of the most important life-saving interventions in like safe consumption sites that was fought for so hard and that has been so successful is now being repealed back with no plan, and that governments are actually able to say we can do this without a plan for any alternative is really something.
Sorry, the plan is forced treatment, which is jail. The plan is jail.
No healthy plan.
No.
Same question to you, Hassan.
So I was born in Libya to migrant workers. I grew up in Dubai. It's a country where, my parents were on tight permits, came here. I was on a study permit. I was on a work permit. I became undocumented. I was actually granted permanent residency and it was taken away. And, my dad's brothers also worked across the Middle East. My mom's brothers worked in Japan. And I say this to you because, not that because it's special, honestly. In fact, the most of the people in the global south are trying to become migrants, right? But I also say this to you because today, in a place like Toronto, the current numbers are that approximately 1 in 7 people don't have permanent resident status. 1 in 7. So each of you either know people or you are living in a specific kind of bubble, right? In 2025, this year, 1.2 million work and study permits were not allowed to be renewed by changes made by the Trudeau government, the so-called progressive government. That comes around to around 3,000, over 3,000 work and study permits expiring daily. Every day, 3,000 workplaces, 3,000 communities, 3,000 friends saw their loved ones depart. Every day of this year. Did you see it? How has this affected you? And inversely, how has it not affected you? So when we talk about the worsening, the expansion of the capitalist colonial project in its various manifestations, be it through war, through racism, through patriarchy, through environmental collapse, and so on and so forth, it happens, and yet it is unseen, right? So when we talk about the expansion, right now, we are seeing, you probably have seen this, immigrants are being blamed for the housing crisis.
Yes.
Right? What does that experience look like? It looks like these 3,000 people being forced out. It looks like our people don't have jobs. We organized a workshop last week or 2 weeks ago for people to be able to get subsidized transit, which they have to apply. There's a special program that the city has created, and it includes migrants, which is a massive step forward. And yet, our people didn't have the money to come to the office to apply for the subsidized transit program, right? Across the country, we are seeing, for example, right now, 70% of the agricultural products in this country, Canada is the world's 5th largest agri-food exporter. This is a place that is actually very much rural. We live in a city, do we know that? 70% of agricultural land has been affected this year because of climate change. Lots of tobacco has shut down. Lots of fruits, like apples couldn't be picked in part of the country. Strawberry couldn't be picked. Are we aware of this? And then who picks this food? It's migrants. Then without jobs. A mushroom plant just a couple of weeks ago just shut down, right? People are being moved. People are coming in and not being able to work. So I want us to really question, and understand that there is this constant, struggle where we talk about improving rights and rights disappearing. But why? how is it that we are seeing next year it's going to be 1.1 million people who are going to have their work and study permits expire? As a population, Canada is a tenth of the size of the US. Okay? That would look like 12 million people in the US, right? Canadians would march for that. Right now, I just saw this hour has 22 minutes. Do a spoof.
Oh my God, I know what you're gonna say.
They did a spoof in which they had a Canadian border guard, and it didn't say ICE, it said nice. There was a bracket and nice.
Stuff.
And the spoof is that this person is standing in the Atlantic somewhere, and a tourist ship is arriving from the US, and they're, making jokes. They're like, oh, do you have any cannabis on you? Oh, no, okay, you can go buy it. They're giving people candy. Like, it's basically how this country is, this benevolent, loving, we aren't racist, right? Do you all know? I mean, but we believe this. We believe this to the point that 1.2 million people have been tossed out of this country this year. And there have been no riots.
Mhm.
There has been no coverage. Right? Maybe you signed a petition. So, so we are in a struggle, right? And the struggle is actually happening. There's an old slogan from the 80s which says unemployment and inflation are not caused by immigration. That's bullshit. Get off it. The enemy is profit. Right? Exactly. Right? Back when slogans were political education. So listen, now it's 3 words. We do the same. Build more homes, more, status for all, whatever. Everyone's doing it. So is Mamdani, so is Pierre Polyev. That's what we're doing. Let's move on. So here's the thing. We are talking about a moment in which wages are low, people are struggling to make ends meet, and if those people are allowed, we, the working class, are allowed to actually just sit with our pain, we will go and literally eat the billionaires. And so to distract and divide the working class, migrant blaming is happening systematically around the world. And that's the problem we're facing.
Mhm. Can I just check that mic real quick? Is it? Here? Okay.
Never heard anyone say, "Not quiet."
I was not accusing you of that. Maybe, Rachel, I'll put the next question to you, which is talk of abolition often includes analyzing what it means to reform systems versus what it means to try and erode systems of power that are hurting us. And there's a lot of conversation about this and a lot of conversation about what kind of reforms actually take power away from our governments and from systems of harm, and what actually might look like it's changing something. And some examples have already been brought up here, but that's actually reinforcing state power. So I want to ask you about that. And I want to ask each of you who wants to speak to this question about kind of like a useful thing that I read in preparing for this was the idea that we really have to argue within ourselves. We have to struggle within ourselves. That something that looks like reform in one place could actually be a step towards eroding power in another place. Or that something that starts off really seeming like it could be a radical prospect for change, once it's enacted, may not live up to that promise. So let's start there. Any thoughts that you might have about the struggle that we have when we talk with one another about like, what are we going to do? And why are we going to do this thing? Why do we believe that this thing over that thing is actually going to get us closer to that abolitionist horizon that we're talking about?
Can I spend 30 seconds on the previous question as well?
I will give you 45.
Because military stuff is really bad right now, guys. Carney, maybe y'all already know this in this room. I don't know. It's been underreported. Carney literally promised to quadruple Canada's military budget by the end of the decade. It's 2025. That's 4 and a bit years. That's crazy. That's basically unprecedented since, I don't know, World War II, that kind of spending here, at least in Canada. This is part of a global arms race as well. This is not just what's happening in Canada. Though, like, really what Carney is promising actually is extraordinary here. So that is like, it's a very big deal. Like, this is actually much worse than this stuff has been. And so we're talking about like about 150 billion per year in the next few years. And like, those are numbers that like are really hard to wrap our heads around. I think it actually might have been you and me, Hassan, who were talking about this, or maybe you crunched these numbers, but it's over 10 times Toronto's entire city budget is what we're talking about. This is the big, for those joining online around the world, this is the biggest city in Canada. We're talking about spending over 10 times the entire city's budget. This is
per year.
Yes. And this is vastly more than the federal government spends on like all health and social transfers to all the provinces and territories combined. Like, this is, it's so beyond astronomical. And overwhelmingly, the money is for like deeper military integration with the US. It's not to defend us from the US, like, which is a kind of ridiculous idea to begin with, but like is literally to become even more part of US military empire. So even with the kind of sort of nonsense nationalist idea Hassan was referring to earlier about like, oh, who are we? We're not the US. Like, or what do we have our ideas about what the Canadian military does? Like, the ideas we have about Canada as a peacekeeper, to be honest, are not true anyway. But even still, this is like, actually, let's throw that entire idea out of the window and let's have the type of military spending like the US has. Let's have a militarized foreign policy like that. So that's like the context that we're in, and it's pretty bad. But I'll move on to your other question, because I think I don't need to talk so much more about like that extortion racket, but really that's what it is, right? It's like this myth. And from an abolitionist context, I think it's the same for police budgets. It's the same for a lot of the colonial and fossil fuel projects. Like, it's this myth, right? Like, oh, well, you'll be safe if only you give us more money, right? Like, Canada will be safe from the world if only the military has more money. You'll be more safe if only police have more budget. Like, it's an extortion racket, and it's untrue, and it's nonsense. But yeah, about reform, like, I think in these moments of encroaching state violence and like this authoritarianism, like, the temptation sometimes can be to ask for less, like to be less bold, like to feel like we have to play it safe, to feel like we can only ask for crumbs, like to appease out of this like fear. When I think, like, in fact, what we need is abolitionism. Like, what we need is actually to go in the opposite direction.
Let me ask you really quickly where you think that comes from. Why do you think there's a tendency in times like this to actually ask for less?
I think it's fear and a feeling of like, we have so little, and there's so much violence against it. Like, what if we lose even more? And what if, and a sense of scarcity amongst our movements. Like, sometimes there's a feeling of, I want to be in solidarity with everyone else, but like, oh no, like, we have so little. But I mean, so Dean Spade was on a panel as part of this conference earlier today and shared 4 questions for evaluating reforms. Because, you know, people often talk about like reformist reforms or non-reformist reforms. It's like kind of annoying language sometimes. So basically what you're asking, like, how do we know whether we're pushing for things that are actually moving us towards the horizon we want, versus we're just kind of like playing around with these institutions and playing into their game and not actually working towards something better. So I actually just want to repeat those because I thought they were super useful. So the first question is this thing I'm pushing for, does it create material change? Or is it something kind of more symbolic that's like basically just going to be PR for the state? Number 2 was, does this legitimize or expand something that we are trying to get rid of? Like, oh, this is a new trans-friendly prison. Yeah, yes, okay, you're expanding the prison industrial complex. Or actually, we're going to build these new greener weapons that use less fossil fuels. Hooray, this is like a real thing.
Carney's taken to talking a lot about decarbonized oil. Try that one out, guys. Decarbonized oil, and he's saying it repeatedly.
Yeah.
And people in the media listen to this, and they just, there's no response.
or even honestly, there's a way in which the idea of like the golden dome is that, oh, it's like this is a just in case missile system where we're just putting missiles in space for literally the first time on planet Earth, by the way. But don't worry, that's just to avoid war, to like avoid militarism. It's like, no, that you're actually building the war machine by doing that. And so the number 3 was, does this reform divide our people into deserving and undeserving? Like, is this separating us? Is this forcing people out and winning these tiny crumbs for only such a small chunk of us? And then finally, the 4th question is, does the way we are organizing for this build power, build our capacity for the next fights, build solidarity? Like, is this a reform that is going to get us further towards that vision of abolition? And I mean, these questions, I mean, I didn't have these exact questions until Dean Spade said them earlier today, and I rigorously wrote them down. But I think these types of questions are super live in our work all the time. And I know for me personally, as one of the folks working on the arms embargo now campaign, this is a space where we are working towards obviously like a complete end to any role that Canada is playing in arming Israel, but also can we make sure we're doing this, in my head, in an abolitionist way? It's not like, oh, don't send those weapons to Israel, send them to Saudi Arabia instead, or send them to Colombia, or send them to another place. Or, oh, let's just make sure that this is done with a various international legal stamp of approval and it's not done in this rogue way. Like, no, how do we make sure we're pushing for this in a way that takes the power away from the weapons company, takes the power away from the war machine, and actually moves us towards a free Palestine, but also towards like truly a better world where the borders apply to everyone except for the weapons, just travel effortlessly amongst them? And how do we hold on to that abolitionist vision, even when we're doing things like trying to pass laws in parliament? Like, how can we do that work of trying to reform a pretty broken system without giving it power, without like disempowering our movements? Like, I don't know the answer. I think I'm just raising more questions.
Of course. Hassan, let me go to you on this because same, like I'm sure in your work all the time, you and the people you work with have these conversations about how do we fight for something without reinforcing the very state power that we're trying to erode.
I'm going to come around to this question. Just stick with me. So I want to begin by saying and really insisting that we are on colonized land and that the struggle for self-determination that Indigenous people are undergoing, which currently is not only, but also about land back, right, is something that we have to actually put our material, spiritual, physical strengths and capacities into. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So that, having said that, and because I've said that, how does that work with the concept of border abolition? Okay. Now, we can talk about the abolition of the police, but we also have to understand that the first thing that the Palestinian resistance did when Israel withdrew from Gaza was to put a police force on the streets because that was necessary. We can talk about the end of the military complex, and yet, and I'm picking these countries very carefully, should we not say that North Korea must be able to defend itself? Should we not say that Cuba and Venezuela should not be able to defend itself? What would have happened if Yemen had not put ships, had blocked the ships going towards Israel? Abolition is complicated because we are where we are. This is why I said it's a North Star, right? The steps towards it, there's no simple solution. Can't just talk about the abolition of the police everywhere. Can't talk about the abolition of the military complex everywhere. We want our people in the global south to be able to defend themselves against the US empire, right? And that requires police and borders and military and sometimes prisons. So what is our task here? And so this is the question you were asking. When we talk about reforms or building our capacity towards it, right? How do we assess what to do here? Sit with that. So I love Dean Spade's questions. I mean, they really remind me of sort of, the Gramscian questions that we have around balances of forces. But I would put it, maybe the only other thing I can add to it is this. Every question must be this: is this building the internationalist working class power that we need to win everything? Not in this state, not just in this time, but everything for everyone.
Bree, I want to ask you about this because obviously there's a lot of contradiction. There's a lot of messiness, as Hussan is just raising. How do you have these conversations with the people that you work with, considering obviously that people are dying today? People need relief right now as we try to work to something bigger.
I think I just want to go off of what you just said, because I think that it brings up again, like this thing of me just pushing everybody to really understand the history, the Indigenous history, not written through the lens of the textbooks that you got in high school or college, but like actual Indigenous history written by Indigenous people and historians. And I think back to the Robinson-Huron Treaty. So our community just won a landmark settlement against the federal government, which was appealed by both the feds and the provincial government. The Robinson-Huron Treaty basically sued the government for the lack of annuities that came out of our territories for a long, long time. That Robinson-Huron Treaty was signed in, I believe, the late 1700s, and it was the actual motivation for that signing of that was Indigenous people asserting their sovereignty over British miners that were coming onto our land and mining without consent. So they occupied a mining site, took a cannon from the British military and shot a cannon, and it was terrifying. The whole, like, everybody, and there wasn't a lot of people on the North Shore of Lake Huron at that time, so they were vastly outnumbered by the Indigenous people, and then signed this treaty. And every year we got $4 for all of the annuities that came off of our land. $4 to this day. $4. It's actually a running joke. We give out cash to people, like, and when we give them $5, we say it's like their treaty money, because it's just literally the biggest joke ever. To every native all across Turtle Island, anyone who's part of a numbered treaty, you get that $5. So that amounted to a multi-billion-dollar settlement that was paid out. And I think that people need to understand that that assertion of sovereignty is something that is very much alive today. And when we look at things like militarism within this country, we always think of things like we're fed this like propaganda. We had all those commercials come out. Remember, like the War of 1812 was like this huge like propaganda campaign in Canada. And it was like, oh, like there was like one native code talker who like contributed and, saved the day. But actually, if you look at the history, Canada, so-called Canada, British, it was at the time, the British and French armies, they were actually allies to the Indigenous people. It was not the other way around. There were contingents of 600 canoes. And I know because my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a war chief who was part of those battles, fighting back what we call the Chmokman, the Americans, who even at that time, hundreds of years ago, are doing the same exact thing that they're doing right now in Palestine. They were known as being brutal, absolutely brutal, and had no regard for women and children, and actually targeted those things on purpose: food, medicine, everything. So if you read back, our people have led and created the boundaries of what we call this country today, even of what we call Ontario. But we are fed this nonstop slop that relegates Indigenous people as wards of the state, that we have no power. And that is a very purposeful mechanism because Canada is afraid politically of what Indigenous people are going to do in the future, what our nations are going to assert here on this land. And I remember, and I mean, these are like, you know, this is the paradox. These are like the things that we have to contend with and in our communities. And I remember, and we have questions like this in abolition. Do we consider our Indigenous on-reserve police forces part of abolition? When the chief of police came to Wiki, the first thing he did was take down the Canada flag. So that makes you wonder, where does this all fit within our communities? And these are serious questions that we have to have. We've always had a mechanism of safety and protection. We've had warriors within our nations, and that doesn't have to exist in the same way that we see it exist within the nation state of Canada. That is a different mechanism, and I think people need to understand that. And that when we return to those original roles, 100%, we have seen a time in this country where Indigenous people have been demilitarized. We saw some of the last armed struggles, of which one of my family members is a political refugee, cannot actually even come onto my community, into his community. And there's been a systematic mandate to demilitarize and disarm Indigenous people and Indigenous movements in this country. But at the end of the day, we are sovereign nations. And that that is the existential fear that Canada has at the end of the day. And guaranteed, this approach to heavily arming the country is very much with that in mind as well. Mm-hmm. So there are so many these things that we have to contend with that they just don't make sense right away, and that we have to work with in our communities. And I think that when you know Indigenous people, you start to understand the nuance of some of the things that I'm talking about. But yeah.
Thank you so much for that. You can keep it. It's okay. For those who are listening online at this point, I'm just going to hold my mic for a second because it's just a little easier for me turning my head. If you're listening online and if you're listening in the audience, we want to give you a chance soon to chime in on this discussion, ask some questions. I know we started late, but I'm trying to keep us somewhat to time. So I'm going to ask the last couple of things of this panel, and I'll try to get some shorter answers from you. No shade at all. I think everyone is really enjoying the thoughtfulness and the rigor of this discussion, and I am. So what I want to ask now is about, from each of you, if you want to answer this question, an example of a campaign or a movement struggle that you have observed, that you maybe even have been part of, that ties into this conversation that we've been having this evening. And I want to focus on things that may not necessarily have ended in some grand victory that everybody can recognize visibly. Because Hussan, just as you said that the struggle that we're facing is often invisible to people, I think a lot of the advancements and the gains are often also very invisible. So this doesn't have to be a headline maker, but some kind of movement work or movement struggle or campaign that you have each learned from that informs your approach to abolitionist thinking, to striving not for what we can do today, but for a goal that is so far into the future. What kind of work, campaigns, movement struggles do you think of when you think of how you've learned about this work? Anybody who wants to pick that up? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I have two, so I'll try and just say each really quick. So this past, oh my God, literally like 2 days ago, this week on Tuesday, a whole bunch of people, over 100 of us, showed up at a weapons fair in London, Ontario, caught them 100% by surprise. and like locked them out of their fancy conference center. It was so fun. And I think that like it felt like it was filled with like an abolitionist ambition and hope and vision of like, what if they actually just like cannot meet in our cities in these fancy buildings behind these closed doors to like literally be the people who profit most off of war and genocide in the world. Like it was like Elbit Systems, it was Lockheed, it was all these local Canadian companies, it was Canadian Armed Forces, friggin' Ontario Minister of Finance, Vic Fidelity. Like it's people who uh they were all planning on like going through a building inside to get right into their conference center. Eventually, they did make it in because the London police really showed up hard for them. Surprise, surprise. But they all had to like walk through the pouring rain and looked like drowned cats by the time they got escorted, sneaked in through like a emergency exit with like a humongous police escort. Like basically, they eventually made it into the building, but like really looking like the war criminals. That they were, plus like half drowned cats. And it was like a moment of like it would have been better if they couldn't get in at all. But it was a moment of like actually how about now? And how about we come together and how about we do this? Um, I mean, I mentioned Elbit and Lockheed and like some of the companies that are most funding and arming the genocide of Palestinians, but like these are also where our CMP shop. These are also and like the London police uses Celebrite and other surveillance technology that was like literally developed by Israeli companies at Palestinian checkpoints, at checkpoints that police Palestinian people, and like these same equipment are also being used at the front lines on Wet'suwet'en territory, where like brand new Canadian policing, militarized policing techniques are tried out. And it was like a brief moment where we got to be like, actually, you don't get to come into your conference today. And that was just like really lovely. But in terms of, I also wanted to say like, so yesterday at the conference, Andrea Ritchie said, criminalization is the antithesis of care, and care is the antidote to violence. And I was thinking about you gave a shout out at the beginning to the Toronto Community Justice Fund, and I want to give a shout out to the Legal Support Committee as well. Like in this context where hundreds of people in our cities have been criminalized for showing up in solidarity, the ways that we support those folks and our community and each other through these court systems really matters. And I think these are examples of doing it in an abolitionist way where we don't actually let the state isolate people and say, okay, now because you've been arrested and charged, you get pulled out, you're alone. You literally have like conditions that don't let you talk to your friends, and you're isolated and you have to pay on your own. And really it's about isolating people, right? And these are projects started grassroots by people in this room and by folks in our city who are like, actually, no, these are going to be places where we bring people who are being criminalized together, where we support each other, and where we build power towards a horizon of actually no more of this. So I want to shout out those projects in that way.
I'm so glad. Thank you. Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned that second one, because when I was reading, I think was Miriam Kaba who was talking about how it's not just about like material struggles, day-to-day struggles that we see against the state that are important for abolition. It's also about like horizons of possibility in people's heart and their mind of what they see, and seeing when you get arrested that there's going to be somebody there to be like, do you have a way to get home today? Do you need something to eat? Are you needing somebody to go with you to the clinic? We're going to have a dinner. Do you want to come? All those kinds of things like matter in a world where it is very easy to just be abandoned, to feel abandoned. It's easy for us to leave each other to our own devices because we're all feeling so overwhelmed. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that second one, especially. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to add to this, right? And that should extend to all people who are criminalized, innocent or not, right? During the G20 would say defend the people, even the innocent ones, right? So just so I mean, of course, we have been on this side of the globe. We have to talk about Haiti. We have to talk about Toussaint Louverture and the fact that the first enslaved people overthrew an imperialist power. And to this day, Haiti is being punished for it. And that punishment is being carried out for a long time by Canadian Armed Forces, right? Of course, right now we have to talk about the resilience and the resurgence and of the Palestinian people. 70 plus years, right? And people have died, and their children are now clutching homes to the keys to the homes and saying, we will return. You know, many times when refugees move, go to other countries, you lose you integrate. But as you know, particularly in the migrant justice understanding of this world, that struggle is immense. I want to, you know, I worked with 113 immigration detainees in a prison in Ontario, and Desmond knows about this, who went on a hunger strike against indefinite detention. And at the end of it, so imagine they were in solitary confinement. They could not communicate. They had been there for 7, 8, 10, 11 years without charges or trial, with no end in sight, just indefinitely jailed. Canada could not deport them, would not release them. Almost entirely black men. And they started, and the first thing, you know, they were asking for initially access to lawyers, because obviously they had no lawyers, access to just basic changes to the prison system, right? But in that process of sort of this struggle, they began to see their capacity and kept raising their demands to the point that they were saying, end indefinite detention, which has since been ended, right, in Canada for now, as we discussed. But I want to talk about this notion of care. And every day that an undocumented mother takes a child to the school, breaking that border, she is choosing to assert an abolitionist future. Every day, a migrant worker in a field refuses a treatment that is very similar, right, to the plantation. He is asserting an abolitionist future. Every day that each and every one of us imagines a better world, we are imagining an abolitionist future. Our task is to find and make the road to it.
Thank you. And when you make the joke about defending everybody, even the innocent ones, I really think about Jackie Wang's Against Innocence and how she talked about Trayvon Martin, who the world rallied around. It's really initiated and launched the Black Lives Matter movement, and how there were so many other Black young people who were killed in the same way, whether by vigilantes like, I won't even say the asshole's name who killed Trayvon Martin anymore, but by the police. That the notion that he was not doing anything wrong was really so much of a motivating factor, and how that is one of those traps. That's one of those reformist traps, that we fight only for people who we believe can be seen to be having done nothing wrong.
Or are political, right? Or part of, you know, protest policing. How's that different from an in-house person or a drug user or a sex worker, or actually somebody who may be considered a criminal, right? Because if we're talking about moving beyond police and prisons, it has to be for everyone.
Go ahead, Bree. Please do silence your electronic devices if you can, please. Thank you.
I'm trying to remember the question. I think it's about,
The question was about any campaigns, movements that you have.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to shout out Idle No More, because that was a huge motivator for specifically and especially young Indigenous people in this country. And that happened in 2012. And I think even one step further from there was the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement that came. There was a lot of work that was being done behind the scenes before Idle No More, but it really, like, I think, elevated that movement. And I think the difference between those movements, and I can speak confidently as somebody who was a young Indigenous person living in an inner city, being a victim of police violence and settler brutality, is that I Don't Know More was like very focused on the federal government, the omnibus bill, the repealing of environmental protections, which is like being also echoed by Bill 5 now. But I think that what MMIWG2S did is that it squarely targeted police and law enforcement in this country. And I remember taking some of the lessons that I had learned from I Don't Know More. I was involved in a lot of like land defense work up in the tar sands, and taking those lessons that I had learned and actually bringing them to like my local police forces in Edmonton and being like so fucking maligned for it. Like it was actually wild. The police chief was like calling my job and shit. And it was like, it was all that rage. And I think it was specifically coming from the Indigenous, like women and Two-Spirit people in our communities. And it was very potent. And even years later, like there's a post on Tier, and it's about Project Sitka, which was the CSIS had created this like, document with all of these movements that are like a threat to national security, and squarely named MMIWG2S movements as part of that. And it was, I think for me, looking back, I'm like, it's because of the focus on the RCMP, the Canadian military, and local police and law enforcement for the direct, this isn't just neglect, this is direct involvement in murders of Indigenous people all across the country, specifically women and children. And I think that that's something that very much still exists today. I had a whole other life, but I did a music video in like 2010, and it was like talking about a serial killer around Edmonton who had killed multiple women. There was a $10,000 reward. And I worked with kids whose aunties and mothers had been missing and gone or gotten murdered. And it was so long that this was happening that people started to say, this actually has to be a police officer or somebody who's involved in that system, because there's no way that we can spend this many years and this much of a campaign and find this many bodies and it not be solved. And to this day, it's never been solved. And we still see those same mechanisms happening all across the country. So I want to say that. I think that's really important. People like Pam Palmater, who is part of that, she has some really great educational work around that crisis, which is directly involved with incarceration. Indigenous women are the fastest growing prison population in the country. It is an international human rights crisis. And I can confidently say that this is a real thing because every single woman or Two-Spirit person in my proximity is facing serious offenses by the police for doing what we do every day. I think the other thing that really like highlighted how sick these mechanisms are was that time that Black migrants were shut out of the shelter system here in Toronto. And I don't think people quite understand how that dynamic is the very root of the Indian Act system in this country. It's basically governments who have a responsibility to not let people die on their watch, essentially. We're calling them to their socialist ideals here, that you have to shelter people. And it was this battle between the two levels of government who didn't want to pay the bill. That is the root of the Indian Act. That is why there's no clean water, drinking water in First Nation communities. That's why our communities have suicide crises. That is why there's healthcare inequity within our communities, is because there's this constant fight about who is going to pay the bill. Who's going to pay for the wards of the state, which is what Indigenous people are under law in this country. So I think that really, in the fight and like the awareness that was brought to like the public's attention was like, people were just like, how is this happening in Canada? How is this this is so blatantly like racist. It is anti-Black racism right in front of our faces, but that mechanism is Canada. So I think I just want to shout out like everyone who did work around that, because it was just really poignant and really important to bring up. Yeah.
Has to be really quick.
Just because we're talking about this, I just have to say this. The city of Toronto basically threw out Black refugees and refugee claimants onto the street to force the federal government, and Mayor Chow kept that in place. It was basically the city did a direct action. They said, we're not going to let them in till you pay us. And 2 people died, right? 2 people died in that process. And so, and like, it's, you know, it's not that, yes, it's like who is going to pay, but the city's move was they're going to force their hand by throwing people out in the street.
The thing that gets me even more about that, Hassan, is that if we were watching the news in the last couple of weeks, Mayor Chow has threatened that that is going to happen again if more new federal funds and provincial funds don't appear. So she's saying, even though we made that decision, and I don't want to get into this because I'll talk all night. They choose to vet people based on their immigration status and not give them services. It's an absolute denial of the sanctuary city policies that people like yourself and many of us have fought for years in this country. And to hear the mayor say, well, that could happen again, as if she has no control, as if it wouldn't be her choice to once again select those people and turn them away. This is what we continue to be fighting for. Anyway, I want you guys to give it up for this incredible panel of warriors. The blood is pumping. The adrenaline is surging. I want to take a couple of questions. I want to start with a question from our live stream because I know people have been listening and watching. So why don't we go there? Oh, I'm sorry. Go there first. We have 5 minutes max. Wonderful. This is an easy job. Okay. Oh my gosh. That one?
That's the line.
We only have 5 minutes for this question. What does abolition of colonialism look like? um, because I really do want to, in 5 minutes, get to a couple of audience questions, some quick reflections on the biggest question of all time.
I think sovereignty of Indigenous nations, but I remember I attended something the other day and someone's like, no one knows what sovereignty is. They don't understand. And we have to, for Indigenous nations in particular, is practice it. It is something that we have to actually do, because when we do it, we're actually usually in direct competition or up against the colonial systems that we have in place, which is a British legal order here. So we have to practice it. It's not just something that we write down or say, but it is a living experience for us as Indigenous people. And I think that when we talk about the work that we do, it's about that radical allyship, is that people, but you can't practice that unless you are aware of what's going on. So that's why I think it's so important that everybody read about Indigenous history. Anyway.
Speaking of, thank you. No, speaking of, I brought up when you were talking about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, I thought about this human rights report from, I guess it's 2013, called Those Who Take Us Away, Abusive Policing and Failures in Protection of Indigenous Women and Girls in Northern British Columbia. And this was the first report that I ever read that implicated police directly in these disappearances and murders of people in our country. So that's one that people can read if they're interested in that topic. I'm going to take a couple real quick from inside the venue. If anybody wants. Sure. You want my mic?
Well, but
It's so that they can hear you. Oh.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this opportunity, and thank you for putting this on. What I find ironic about this is that we're sitting in a house of worship. We're sitting in a house of worship from a religion that has been at the forefront of perpetrating the horrors that our world continues to struggle with. Not one of you has talked about the abolition of religion. Not one of you has talked about the abolition of gender violence. Not one of you has talked about how gender violence and religion have created the population crisis we're dealing with. Not one of you has talked about that. So when you talk about abolishing things, this would be a good start. What are your thoughts on that? Not just Christianity, by the way, the whole bunch.
We'll also go over here and just take another question at the same time so that we can answer them collectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for for you and for the work you all do, and appreciate your time and energy in this space today. What you've all shared and what you've all talked about is not easy, but I'm glad that this space is being made for us to do this collectively. My question would be very early on in the first question that you posed. Someone mentioned that it feels like a luxury to even imagine, right? To like even take up that space to imagine. And yet, throughout the talk, I kept hearing very concrete ways in which that imagination wasn't just this theoretical thing. No, we're doing it. We are the doing is the imagining, and in doing we are building, and multiplying what that building can mean. And so I guess my question is, during this talk, after this talk, even as I'm posing this, are there does it still feel like a luxury? And if it does, like what do we need to do collectively to ensure that, because to me it seems like this is also a realm that has become bordered and policed, the imagining of these futures. And so it seems like more than ever, it's also the ground in which we have to resist. So yeah, just some thoughts around that would be much welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to start by saying that the religious trauma that Indigenous people experience in this country is very multidimensional. It has led some of our community to completely denounce the church. It has led to an entire generation of survivors who embrace the church. It is not our prerogative within our communities to dictate what that experience is for people. We very much work in opposition. We actually have held actions outside of churches here in Toronto, the Catholic Church specifically. The Catholic Church and the Pope was one of the only people that said Canada committed genocide and put it on record, when the TRC said it was cultural genocide. So these are the dynamics that, again, are very multidimensional. Some people burn down churches. That is a reality for Indigenous people. Oftentimes we'll get the argument, well, you know, people in Islam don't care about Indigenous people. People will say that. I was not colonized by Islam. I was colonized by Christianity. So Indigenous people's experience with that faith group in particular is deep-rooted. And on the other hand, we come from a community whose cultural and spiritual connections to the land here have been under attack for centuries. And I have never known it to be a prerogative of Indigenous people to turn that harm that has been inflicted on us and try to subvert other people's faith practices. It is actually rooted within our teachings where we don't do that. Yes, we can address systems of harm, which very much exists today. We do that work, 100%. And then also about the gender-based violence. I don't know if you missed my last question, but my entire talk, question I answered was about gender-based violence. It was about, I am myself here, an Indigenous woman who is queer. I have a child with a trans person who themselves might choose to be any gender that they want. I think some of these things are, it is just coded into who we are. I don't feel like it's almost like explicit that I have to say it, but I just want to leave it there. Now, you go ahead.
I really appreciated the question about, I think it was me who maybe said the thing about luxury. And I think maybe I was a little bit calling myself out for sometimes acting in this like urgency. Everything is so terrible. We do this, we do this, we do this. And like, am I giving myself the space? Am I in the groups and the people that I organize with? Like, are we taking the time to really hold that abolitionist horizon and to talk through these ideas? And I actually like want to give a shout out to, so after we wrap here, like there is a little bit more time for going to these tables, for talking with the folks here. Like everyone who is tabling there is part of a group where we actually get to work through this shit together, because us each individually thinking through stuff is cool and reading through stuff is cool, but like the work towards abolition has to happen together with others, has to happen in groups. It has to happen through organizing together, through talking out this stuff, but also doing the work every single day. And for folks who are not part of a group, now is a great time to join one. And I would encourage folks, I also want to give a shout out to like Serge, who does not have a speaker on this panel, but I know is welcoming new members. Toronto World Beyond War is now welcoming new members as well. And I'm sure Hassan and Bree would love to talk, possibly Desmond as well, but groups that they're involved in. Because like the abolition happens through the doing and happens through the doing with others, and us deciding like, actually, it's not a luxury to come together and discuss these ideas and to really talk about the world that we want. Like that actually just has to be part of our regular lives. And I think a lot of groups in the city are making the space to do that.
Thank you. I think the task before us is to move beyond the question of rights completely. Okay? And to move beyond the question of the state as the primary arbiter of justice and fairness. And that is an incredibly difficult task. And on the question of imagination, thank you. What is a framework? What is a call? What is a slogan that you believe posits such a world? Right? So in our movement, we say status for all. It's very simple. But once everyone has status, you can't have borders. Everyone, everywhere, equal access, right? Because the whole point is the state exists through the control of who is in and who's out. Take that power away, no borders, no nations, no states as we can imagine it. I think we could do this. We primarily, I mean, this isn't how I usually talk, by the way. So my colleagues are here, they're like, what are you doing? We organize migrant farm workers, domestic workers, international students, undocumented people, refugees, people who leave behind, working class people, not activists, not academics, who leave behind their own home community, sacrificing family, relationships, going into debt, and then they arrive here and they're being exploited, and they come to us and we say to them, capitalism is the problem. But each and every one of them has chosen to give up all of this to be able to succeed in capitalism. And we do it. We do it without question. We have thousands of members in the country, right, who are choosing to meet and have these conversations. So I think if it can be done with seasonal workers, where employers won't let us get into farms, where people can be kicked out are kicked out every 8 months, then I think we can do it everywhere.
Want to make sure that we once again remind people that you can make a donation if you're able to the Toronto Community Justice Fund. How and where can people do that? TCJF for those of you on the live stream as well, tcjf.ca. That's the Toronto Community Justice Fund, making sure that the people who are out here, some of the people who are out here putting themselves on the line and doing direct actions can have a soft landing when things happen, when they get criminalized. That's very important. The ongoing work of Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction is very important. You'll see them out there. You'll see, I think I said standing up for racial justice before, and it's showing up for racial justice. And it's late and stuff. But please check them out. Please check out the Panay collection. Please have some more food. I think there's going to be some more food available. Meet and greet and stick around. For those of you who've been watching us online, thank you very much for being with us this evening. For everybody who decided to come out here on a Saturday evening, Blue Jays notwithstanding, thank you very much. Thank you once again to World Beyond War. Thank you to our panelists. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.